The first sound I remember that morning wasn't my heartbeat or the wind howling outside my window. It was the slam of the door that told me my life, as I knew it, had just ended. Snow was falling hard, thick as flour, the kind that muffles the world and makes everything seem slower. I stood on the porch, holding the only suitcase I could carry, watching the shadow of my son disappear through the frosted glass. "Mom, please don't make this harder," he had said moments before. His voice was low, rehearsed, not the warm tone that once called me Mama. Behind him stood his wife, arms folded, eyes sharp as icicles. "This isn't your home anymore," she said flatly. And that was it. No argument, no time to pack the photo albums, the Christmas ornaments, or the blanket I'd crocheted when he was born. Just a suitcase, a wallet with $23, and a heart that suddenly felt much older than 72. I stepped into the storm, and the wind swallowed me whole. I walked for what felt like hours, through slush and silence. The town lights flickered in the distance, tiny golden sparks against the endless gray. My fingers burned from the cold, my thoughts burned worse. I had nowhere to go. No one waiting, no idea how a woman my age was supposed to start again. By the time I reached the small diner at the edge of town, my boots were soaked through. I pushed open the door and the smell of coffee and bacon hit me like a memory I didn't ask for. A waitress looked up, startled. "Ma'am, are you okay?" I nodded. I wasn't. She poured me a cup of coffee anyway. "On the house," she said. It was too hot to drink, but I held it close, pretending the warmth could melt something inside me. When I stepped back into the cold, I saw the bus stop across the street. A faded sign read, "Anchorage, 4:15 p.m." I had no plan, no destination, just a need to keep moving, anywhere but there. I bought a ticket with my last cash and climbed aboard. The driver gave me a look, one of those glances that says, "You don't belong here," but is too polite to voice it. I sat in the back by the foggy window and watched the world roll past, the frozen rivers, the forests of white and gray, and every so often a reflection of myself, tired eyes, thin lips, a woman who had given everything and somehow ended up with nothing. I don't remember falling asleep, but I woke up when the driver called, "End of the line, ma'am." End of the line. It sounded fitting. Anchorage didn't greet me so much as tolerate me. Cities don't open their arms, they open their doors if you can pay, and I couldn't pay for much. I stepped off the bus with a suitcase that rolled badly and a coat that remembered better winters. There was a motel near the terminal with a flickering vacancy sign that looked like it had been losing an argument with the wind for years. I paid for 2 nights with what little remained and spread my clothes across the heater like a poor woman's prayer flag. The first night, I didn't sleep. I listened to the radiator cough and the upstairs neighbor pace and thought about all the rooms I had kept tidy in my life, the nursery with the blue curtains, the kitchen where I learned to stretch meals in time, the den where my husband read the paper carefully as if ink could bruise. Rooms had once obeyed me. Now even the lamp seemed to prefer the shadows. Morning found me older. Grief does that. Turns sleep into a rumor and time into a weight. I made a plan, because plans feel like strength, even when they're just lists. Coffee, bank, groceries, a space that wasn't borrowed, work if anyone would have me. It wasn't heroism, it was arithmetic. The bank opened at 9. The woman behind the counter had a face practiced in sympathy. I asked for a withdrawal, and she asked if I was sure. That's the thing about poverty. People ask if you're sure about survival as if you had options. I took what I could and folded the slips into my wallet with hands that didn't want to shake in public. Outside, the sky was a flat kind of gray that made you think the sun had somewhere better to be. I walked to a small market 2 blocks down and bought bread, instant oatmeal, a jar of peanut butter, a bag of coffee, and a cinnamon stick for courage. I added matches, a tin cup, and a pack of cheap socks because my feet had been telling sad stories all night. I didn't know Anchorage well enough to claim it, but every city has an edge where the money runs out and the wind gets louder. I followed the edge until the buildings got shorter and the yards got taller. That's where the houses fade into memory. Porches tilting forward like old men on park benches. Windows ringed with frost from the inside. I wasn't looking for beauty, I was looking for possibility. I found a place that looked like stubbornness pretending to be a house. The roof was mostly honest. One window had plastic stretched tight and taped with faith. The back door stuck but gave way to a shoulder that had pushed through worse. I told myself I was just warming up inside for a minute. Then I told myself I could sweep a little while I warmed up. Then I found a broom and made a space where I could set the tin cup on a crate and call it a table. I didn't move in, I just didn't move out. People think new beginnings feel like trumpet music and sunrise. They don't. They feel like quiet defiance. They feel like learning where the cracks are so you can tape them before the next storm. I boiled water on a camp stove, bought years ago for a picnic that never happened, and made coffee the way I had when I was young and poor and convinced both conditions were temporary. I broke the cinnamon stick in half and let it sit in the cup until the steam smelled like memory I wasn't ashamed of. I learned the house, which boards complained underfoot, which corner wanted a bucket even on dry days, which nail at the door caught sleeves as if begging for company. I opened the cupboard and found a single plate shaped like a sunflower, chipped but willing. I washed it as if it had been left to me in a will. By afternoon, the wind practiced its old tricks, and the plastic over the window hummed like a badly tuned violin. I lit a candle, not because I needed more light, but because fire has a way of telling your heart it isn't alone. I put on the new socks, which felt like gratitude, and ate half of the bread with peanut butter because there is a kind of hunger that has no interest in elegance. The second night, sleep came late but stayed. Morning arrived as a pale square on the wall, and with it came a decision dressed up as curiosity. I would walk into town and ask quietly if anybody needed a pair of reliable hands. I had been many things in my life: mother, wife, accountant of small economies, manager of repairs, first responder to everyone else's crisis. Somewhere in that list, I could carve out usefulness. The cafe announced itself by smell before it announced itself by sign. Butter, coffee, something sweet. The window fogged from warmth and conversation. On the glass was a painted name that made me smile despite myself: Northern Light. Inside, a woman with flour on her apron and safety pins where buttons should have been smiled at me like we were already on each other's side. She didn't ask for a resume. She asked if I could wipe tables, pour coffee, and be kind to the sort of people who took their kindness black with 2 sugars. I told her I had been doing versions of that for 50 years. I started that afternoon. The cafe had its own weather system: bells and spoons and laughter and the soft thunder of old boots. Men in orange vests, women with knit hats pulled down to their eyebrows, a boy reading a paperback with the concentration of someone who hadn't yet learned to be embarrassed by joy. I moved between them like a small boat that knew how to stay upright. There are jobs you do for money and jobs you do to remember who you are. This one somehow was both. I learned to steam milk without scalding it, and to read the difference between the kind of silence that wanted company and the kind that wanted distance. I made a drink one morning without permission, coffee with a sliver of orange peel and a dusting of cinnamon, something my husband used to ask for on the first snow of the season. The owner tasted it and nodded. If it sells, it stays. By lunch, it had a name: the Northern Breeze. By evening, regulars were calling it the one the new lady makes. He came in 3 days later, the man the city sends when the city wants to help without making a speech. His jacket said fire and rescue, but his face said he learned how to carry other people's fear without making it about himself. He ordered the drink with the orange and cinnamon, pronounced it better than it needed to be, and left a folded note on the counter that said,
If you're living out past the yard with the blue mailbox, call me if the wind gets ideas. He signed it Harold and drew a small pine tree as if it were a promise. I didn't call, but the next morning there was a knock at the door of the stubborn house, and he stood there with a cast-iron stove that knew other winters. City surplus, he said, which is how angels apologize for being practical. We installed it together in a conversation that lived mostly in the spaces between words. He cut kindling the way men cut bread when they're thinking about something bigger than hunger. When he left, the room had two kinds of warmth.
The days began to stack in better shapes. I knew which bus would get me close when the sidewalks were mean. I learned the names of the boys who shoveled snow cheap and the neighbor who hung blankets over her windows and called it design. I put a pine sapling in a cracked enamel pot and set it on the sill near the good window because every room deserves a future. I wrote down the cafe schedule in a notebook the motel had left behind. 3 morning shifts, 2 afternoons, Sundays only if someone was sick. The notebook looked relieved to be useful again. People talk when you hand them things, coffee, napkins, the small confirmations that they still belong to the world. That's how I learned the city in a language that wasn't on any map. A fisherman taught me the names of storms that never made national news. A teacher told me which months the sun was more rumor than fact. A grandmother confessed that some days she came in just to watch strangers be gentle with each other, because it helped her walk back home kinder than she would have been otherwise. The day my son walked in, winter had softened just enough to make you think spring might be a real place and not a myth. He didn't see me at first, my apron, my hair tied back, my ordinary place behind the counter. His wife stood half a step behind him, looking at everything that wasn't me. They sat. They said nothing. I made their coffee because there are rituals older than resentment. He came to the counter finally, hands conspicuously empty, eyes that couldn't decide between shame and practice. I waited. I had learned to let people arrive at their own words. When he spoke, it was the voice of a man who had negotiated with numbers until they stopped listening. We need help. Need wears down edges faster than anger does. I told him to come by the house the next day when the cafe wasn't busy and my heart would have time to set. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I made room for the kind of decision that doesn't become a weapon later. That evening, I cleaned the stubborn house like a woman expecting company she isn't sure she wants. I wrote 3 words at the top of a page. Terms, truth, respect. Under that, smaller, no shouting, no blame. Plan only. I added Harold in the margin because I had learned the hard way that telling someone decent you might need them is not a weakness. It's a line you draw around yourself so you don't forget where you begin. I slept, not from peace, from preparation. He came on time, which surprised me. He had always been the kind of boy who believed time was the thing mothers would stretch for him. His wife didn't come in. She remained in the car with her face turned to the window, as if glass could pick a side. He sat on the crate I called a chair and looked around at the room I had reclaimed from neglect. It embarrassed him, I think, to see how little I needed to continue. I poured coffee in the tin cup, 1 cinnamon stick broken between us like a treaty. He told me the story in numbers first. Investments that weren't. Plans that were other people's dreams wearing his name. A house that had decided to belong to the bank. A job that had turned into a rumor. He wrapped words around mistakes the way men wrap tape around leaks, tight enough to hope and loose enough to fail. When he finished, we sat like 2 people who had both run out of strategy. Then I did what mothers do when love has to be built with tools. I asked for a hammer and nails. We made a list, the ugly kind that starts with debts and ends with humility. Call the bank not to beg, but to negotiate. Sell what doesn't keep you warm or honest. Find work with a schedule and a supervisor. If you want my help, you'll take my rule. No lies to the people who save your life. He nodded at each point as if nodding could change physics. I told him it couldn't. You can't lean on the air. You learn to lean on good wood. He left with a list and something that looked like oxygen in his chest. I stood at the door and watched the car pull away. His wife turned once and studied the house as if trying to figure out how someone like me stayed upright. I didn't wave. I had been generous enough for one afternoon. When the quiet arrived, I made another cup of coffee and carried it outside. The snow had a crust that broke gently underfoot, like frost deciding to forgive. I walked to the edge of the yard and stood until my breath paced itself. The pine in the enamel pot brushed the window when the wind spoke. I touched the glass with 2 fingers and let the cold climb my skin until it met the warmth and called it truth. I didn't know how the story would end. I only knew I had found a way to be a person again in a city that didn't care whether I did. That was enough for a Tuesday. And still, as I stood there, the horizon did something it hadn't done for me in months. It widened. Not with promise, with space. Space to place a future that didn't require permission. The next morning at the cafe, Harold walked in with a box under his arm and a grin that didn't need practice. He set the box on the counter like a magician unveiling an honest trick. Inside was a small, battered sign, hand-painted. The letters a little crooked in a way that felt human. Try the northern breeze. It tastes like hope. I laughed the kind of laugh that fixes a person from the inside. We hung the sign near the register, and people ordered the drink just to see if a sign could keep a promise. It did. Not because of the orange peel or the cinnamon, because names matter. Because on a winter day in Anchorage, sometimes what you need most is a reason to say yes to something small. By closing time, the city felt a fraction softer. Not kind, not safe, just less committed to my undoing. That was enough to walk home in the pale blue dark without feeling hunted by the past. I didn't go to bed early. I sat by the stove and wrote another list, one that had nothing to do with my son. A list of ways to remain the person I had rediscovered. Work, warmth, friends made on purpose, a plant to take personally, a street to memorize, a drink to perfect, a life to tell the truth about. When the candle guttered, I whispered goodnight to the room as if it were a child, and to myself as if I were finally worth such kindness. Then I slept like people do when the future is not guaranteed, but the next morning is. And in the morning, Anchorage, indifferent, unfinished, vast, gave me a sunrise that looked like a dare. I took it. 3 weeks later, I was in the cafe when the phone behind the counter rang, the one that never rang unless the universe had something inconvenient to say. Doris picked it up, nodded twice, and handed it to me. "For you," she said softly. "He sounds nervous." It was my son. His voice was thinner than I remembered, like the air up a mountain where sound forgets how to carry itself. "Mom," he began, "I did what you said. I sold the car. I called the bank. They're giving us time. We're staying at a friend's cabin for now." The way he said "we" told me she was still with him. I waited. "Thank you," he whispered, "for not shutting the door." There was more silence than talk after that, but it was a good kind, the kind that let both of us breathe without counting the years between words. When I hung up, Doris looked at me and smiled the way people do when they see someone start to unlearn grief. "Coffee on the house," she said. "Your hands are shaking." That night, Anchorage was mercifully quiet.
The snow had settled into a steady rhythm against the window, and the stove hummed its small hymn. I made myself a cup of northern breeze and sat by the pine, which had grown another inch since New Year's. Funny how life kept rising even when no one was watching. Harold stopped by on his way home, brushing snow from his jacket, cheeks pink from the cold. "He's still up?" he asked. I was waiting for the world to give me good news. It finally did. He grinned, that slow, crooked grin that made you think of summer even in the dead of winter. Then he nodded toward the cup in my hands. "That your secret recipe?" "It's not a secret anymore. Half the town's addicted." He laughed, but his eyes lingered on me, soft and searching, as if trying to read the fine print of my heart. "You've changed," he said finally. "Not just the house or the job. You." Maybe I just remembered who I was before the world told me otherwise. He took a step closer, the light from the stove catching the lines on his face. "Then let's keep you that way." It wasn't a confession, it was an invitation, quiet, respectful, but steady as a promise.
Spring in Alaska doesn't announce itself. It creeps in on tiptoes, pretending to still be winter, until one day you realize the snow has given up arguing. The ice melts from the gutters. The pine by my window grows impatient, and I find myself opening the door without a coat. The cafe was busier now, and Northern Breeze had somehow become its unofficial anthem. We added it to the menu board permanently, right below hot cocoa with a purpose. Tourists came in asking for it by name. Doris said she was thinking of opening a second location, half joking that I'd have to manage it. I told her I was too old for promotions. She told me not to lie to her face. I still lived in the stubborn little house, but it was no longer falling apart. Harold and the fire crew helped fix the roof in exchange for coffee and pie. The children who used to bring me candles came by after school to check on Grandma Nora. I didn't correct them. There are worse things to be called. One afternoon, a letter arrived. Not a bill, not an advertisement, but a real letter, handwritten. My son's. The envelope was creased, the handwriting cautious. Inside, a photo. Him, his wife, and their newborn baby wrapped in a blanket I recognized. The one I thought I'd lost in the move. The note was short. "Mom, her name is Grace. We want her to know the woman who taught us to start over. If you're ready, come meet her." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The old ache rose like a tide, but this time it didn't drown me. It lifted me. I set the photo on the table beside the pine tree and whispered, "Grace, huh? You picked the right name, kid." That night, I didn't make a list. I didn't need to. The rules were already written into my days. Truth, respect, no shouting, no blame. Only life. Only love. The quiet kind that doesn't need an apology to exist. Harold came by again, snow melting in his hair, and saw the photo. "They reached out," he said. "They did." He smiled. "You going?" "Not yet, but someday. Then I'll drive you." It wasn't a proposal. It was a promise to keep walking beside me, and maybe, just maybe, to start the rest of our lives in step. That night, before bed, I walked outside with my cup of coffee and looked at the small pine by the window. It was taller now, its branches strong, defying the last stubborn pieces of snow. Above it, the northern lights began to shimmer. Green, violet, gold, as if the sky was practicing forgiveness too. The world wasn't perfect. My hands still ached in the cold. My son still had a long way to go. But for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for things to be better before being grateful. Inside, the cafe sign, "Try the Northern Breathe," glowed faintly through the glass. And I thought about how strange it was that a drink, a stove, a stubborn house, and a handful of kind people could rebuild a person from the ruins. I turned off the last light, but one lamp near the window stayed on, just a small golden glow in the dark. I left it that way on purpose, Because some lights don't need to be bright to mean something. They just need to stay on.